Hello everyone, welcome in, welcome back if you're a returning viewer. If you're new, my name's Charlotte and this is July's reading wrap up. I don't have anywhere good to clip my mic today because my hair is down, so hopefully the sound is okay. But yeah, welcome in, how's everyone doing? I don't know where July went. I didn't read as much in July as I usually would have, but I think it was just because I was busy. I almost hit a reading slump. I say I didn't read as much as I usually do, but I actually read 5 books in July. May and June were really good months for me, so I think that's why I felt like I hadn't read as much, but actually looking back at it, I did, and one of them was really long. So yeah, let's get into reviewing. I should probably tell you what my total is for the year so far. So for 2022, it's not 2022, it's 2025. So for 2025 so far, I've read 44 books and 5 of them were in July. I read 2 physical books in the month of July and 3 digital books. If this is your first time watching one of my reading wrap-ups, these are mainly spoiler free. If I do need to go into spoilers for the book for whatever reason, I will give you plenty of time to get away. I'm only really going to be telling you what you can glean from other people's reviews online or the blurb, that kind of thing. So starting off strong with my first read for the month, I read Brokeback Mountain by Annie Proulx. This is a fiction book. It's LGBTQ+ fiction, and what I like to do is give a little synopsis so you know kind of what the book is about. Ennis Dunbar and Jack Twist are 2 ranch hands. They're our main characters. They have both been assigned to the same job over summer, being sheep handlers up in the mountains. Isolated in the mountains and sharing a tent, their trysts seem somewhat inevitable, and what initially started as something casual blooms into something much deeper over the summer. The 2 cowboys leave the mountain and they get married and they have kids because that's what cowboys should do. But over the years they manage to preserve what little and limited time they have together in a series of stolen moments. Were they lovers? Worse. This is deeply one of my favourite books. This was a reread for me. I read this for the first time in college when I was about 16. And although I don't usually do star ratings on this channel anymore, I do always go out of my way to tell you when a book is 5 stars, because that for me is like a really important measure still. So this is definitely a 5-star read for me. I feel like most people will have seen the film, but yeah, like I said, I read this in college and since then it's really had a lasting impact on me. So I went to go find a physical copy secondhand and I was really excited to revisit it. And I feel like I've talked about it loads. I think it's because I spoke about it in one of my older videos, then I spoke about it on my book talk, and now I'm talking about it here. I saw this and I was like, surely I've already reviewed this, and I think I have, just not in this format. I don't know how Annie Proulx has quite managed to cram decades worth of relationship into a little over 60 pages, but she has managed it, and it is exactly as poignant as you'd expect it to be. Despite its length, this is one of those books that really has the full weight and impact of a novel. It feels so heavy and so complete in its writing. I cried reading this, which I didn't actually expect. I really tried to take my time with it and savor it, because 60 pages you can just do like in no time at all. But yeah, this one was definitely one to sit with for a bit longer for me. I think it's nothing short of a masterpiece. I think as well to call it a story about gay cowboys is somewhat reductive, because it's more of like a story about longing and desire and hidden identities and everything they can and cannot have. Their relationship somehow survives the test of time, but not the violent intolerances of their community and their like immediate society. This book is definitely about love, but straight from the start you have the sense that it's also about inevitability and the inevitability of heartbreak. And I think that really does weigh heavy in each word. She's managed to write that and like suffuse that into each sentence really effectively. Sorry if you can hear outside because my window is open. It's really hot today. I need a little breeze on me while I'm recording, and there's people having conversations outside. The imagery and the atmosphere is just painted so well in this book, like relationship aside and like the characters aside. You can feel like the cold mountain air of the breeze while you're reading. You can feel like the rocky terrain under your feet while you're walking. It's a very sensory experience while you're reading this. All the time you can like feel the damp, heavy tent fabric, and you can like smell the musty old fabric. The life that these men lead is like rough work. It's calloused work. Their lives are embodied by this like no frills element of ranching, and at the same time she's painted this like sensory landscape that you feel so involved in, but it's like tinted with this awful sense of dread. It's like intermingled in everything. You just have this sense of dread as you watch the years pass, and partially this is probably due to the fact that I knew what had happened because I read this book before. I've seen like half the film, but also because the setting and the tone and the atmosphere is so clearly laid out. A romantic relationship between 2 men, between 2 working lower class men, cannot be fully realised in the town that they live in, let alone be given the opportunity to thrive. And ultimately, on top of everything all, I think it's a story about persecution. What was really interesting to me on the reread is that that there is this sincerity to the writing and to the words and to the characters and the verbiage. And it took me a while to get into the flow of the conversation and the cadence and how they talk and all of like the ranch slang, because it's such like deep country ranching language, or what I imagine that language would be, given that I have very limited experience with that. And because it's typed as such and like written as such, there was a few moments where I was like reading it and I was like, I don't understand what they're saying, and I had to like go back and reread it, because you can like hear the accent, you can hear the turn of phrase. But if anything, that helped me sit with it a bit longer. You know what I was saying about like having to slow down and read. I think when I read it for the first time when I was 16, that's just the way they spoke, but now I'm reading it again at 29, I'm like, oh, this is the way they're talking, like this is where they're speaking, but listen to what they're saying. But yeah, I read this over the span of a few days. I easily could have done it in like one sitting, but it deserves so much more than that. To me, this is just such a compelling story, and I think it's a bit of a must read, I would say. I'm going to watch the movie soon. I've never actually sat and watched the movie the whole way through. Like I said, I think I've only made it halfway through, but I would like to watch it and compare while it's still fresh in my mind. It's such an iconic Brokeback Mountain line, but my favourite line. There was some open space between what he knew and what he tried to believe, but nothing could be done about it. And if you can't fix it, you've got to stand it. The impact of that. My next read for July was my second physical book of the month, and this was Milkfed by Melissa Broder. Our main protagonist, Rachel, is a 24-year-old Jewish woman. She is disconnected from her religion and instead finds herself worshipping at the altar of obsessive and compulsive food rituals. And she maintains her illusion of control through obsessive restriction and calorie counting. She meets Miriam, an Orthodox Jewish woman who is intent on feeding her, and Rachel becomes obsessed. She's fascinated by Miriam's relationship to faith, to her family, to her body, to food. This was my third Melissa Broder, and I loved it. This is so funky and weird, and honestly like a winning recipe for a book for me. Elements of religion, it's sapphic, it covers loads of food, the perfect intersection of all three. I am very late to the party on this because I know this did the rounds like quite a while ago now. For me, what made this book such a good read is there were a few things that I'm deeply interested in reading about. Firstly, religion, and how religion and sexuality shape such a huge part of identity. Then I'm really into food and its relation to culture, and how culture and religion impact your eating habits, the spiritual significance of food, religious celebrations, and how food plays a huge part into that. And then lastly, food and love, how feeding is an act of intimacy and significance, of sharing food with people you love, the intimacy of preparing a meal, taking the time to prepare a meal and give it to other people, and how food and sharing a meal ultimately is like culturally intimate. As someone that was raised Catholic, is bisexual, and loves food and like everything about it, and loves eating and cooking, this is like deeply the book for me. It's like the perfect storm, I think. I'm also really interested in Orthodox Judaism and the practice, because it's not something I know very much about. I've done a lot of reading about it in the past 3 to 4 years, and growing up, that was just never a community or a culture that I was really exposed to en masse. So yeah, really interesting for me. I feel like I learned a bit from this book. This book is so weirdly obsessive and erotic and kind of repulsive in a way that feels like very distinctly Melissa Broder to me. Something about the way she writes is so honest and like so specific, especially with regards to like sexual experiences. It's almost a bit clinical when you're reading the sexual experiences in the book. It's like you're having an out-of-body experience, and the character is as well. Not just for this book, but for the Pisces as well. Everything and like all the experiences around sex just feel like fishbowly, mechanical and clinical in a way that is like so gross and so disgusting, but also like probably the deepest form of intimacy and like sensuality that you'll get. There's a line, and this is not too much of a spoiler, but there's basically like a scene where she's sleeping with someone and she gets like a waft of their nether regions, and she says the smell reminds her of like a damp basement or like a musty basement. And removed from the context of the book, I do think that sounds kind of derogatory and awful, but actually that's your instant reaction. Remove that from your preconceived notions of like how people should smell. It's just something about the removal of the sexuality from that descriptor is so interesting to me. The line just really stuck with me. I don't know, it's so specific. Rachel, as the narrator, speaks about it very neutrally, and I love a book that provides like a full sensory experience, and that is just like so specific. I don't know, I just thought it was like really clever writing. Then we have Rachel, who is just so hungry all the time, and we see this like burning of hunger and then the burning of desire, and the two get intermingled and become the same thing. And there's probably something really profound that I could say about that if I could string a sentence together enough about it, but my thoughts aren't quite fully formed on it yet. There's something there about being hungry and then being full. The lines of desire and hunger sugar, blurring, binge eating, and then also her gaining weight as a byproduct from her sexual relationship with Miriam. It's a decadent book, but I don't think it really takes itself too seriously at the same time, which is what I kind of enjoyed about it. It wasn't too pretentious. The whole thing kind of reads as a joke at some points, like you feel like it's a bit satirical. There are some really, really, really awfully cringy bits, which is quite typical of Melissa Broder's writing, I find, where like I literally want to like look away from the page. I can't stand it. There's a dinner scene where Rachel talks about being pro-Palestine in front of a family who have a son in the IDF. Oh my God, and it just literally made like my teeth fall out of my head. It was awful to read. I felt like I was at that dinner table. There is a section in the middle of the book where I felt like it did start to drag a little bit and get a bit repetitive in the sense that it meandered and wandered so much with her internal narrative. I didn't really feel that engaged, but I do feel like that portion of slow pacing did resolve itself, and then I was able to carry on enjoying the book. It wasn't my favourite Broder book. I did prefer The Pisces. That's one of my favourite books, and that was my first Melissa Broder. And actually, now I think back on it, I think while I was reading it I did have some criticism, but I didn't jot any of it down and it seems to have disappeared from my mind, so clearly it can't have been that big of a criticism. I don't know if it was quite a 5-star for me, but I would say I just actually really enjoyed reading it, so like on enjoyment purposes it was a 5-star. I do think if you want a bizarre read to shake things up, this is probably worth it. It's bizarre, but it's quite commercial and quite palatable, and I can see why people like it so much, but I can also see from reviews that people find this very, very divisive. And obviously what I will always say is please research your own trigger warnings before heading into this. I've probably covered it somewhat, but this book does have heavy themes of eating disorders, binging, restricting, purging, like poor familial relationships, and there are lots of other themes that probably are worth a mention, but that is kind of like the main undercurrent of the whole book is a woman with an eating disorder, so please proceed with caution and take care of yourself. The next book I read was on my Kindle, and it was The Will of the Many by James Islington, and this was a fantasy book. This is the first in a series, but the second book isn't out. Our main character, Viz Telemus, tells people that he is an orphan and tells people that by a stroke of good fortune and adoption, he has been granted access into the most prestigious academy and school in the hierarchy. I picked up this book because I thought it was a standalone. Surprise, it's not. I had no idea what this is about when I picked it up. It's just been in my Kindle library for ages, and while it was a bit of a dense read, it was a good read and I did enjoy it. It took me a bit of a while to get through, it was a bit of a slog. I do think if I had done more research, I might not have picked this up as soon as I did, purely based on the fact that this is about a boy who has to infiltrate an academy of very privileged children. In this academy preps these kids for positions in like high court life, so senators, politicos, army generals, etc. The system on the hierarchy, I believe, is based on a Greek political structure, like Greek civilization. So there's a lot of Greek language. The various positions are like Magnus, Quintus, Sextus, Tertius. And I don't want to draw comparison, but it is a very common like book structure and trope. And I have just finished Red Rising, so it was quite similar. Red Rising was fresh in my mind when I picked this up, and I just thought, oh, what have I done? I'm not saying it's on purpose, but it's just because it's in my mind. That aside, it was very different to that still, and it was very good. I love a fantasy school, and technically I think this is very, very well written. James Islington is a good storyteller. The concept of will, as in the will of the many, I found quite difficult to wrap my head around though. Basically, you can and should cede your will to those in positions of higher power than you, and your will is essentially like your life force. Octavii, being the lowest position in the pyramid, is basically like a massive pyramid scheme. Will is your life force and used for like many other things, so it's used to power a lot of things in the society. So we're talking like ships, everyday kind of like mechanicals, lifts, machinery to make you a better fighter, to make you stronger. It has multiple uses, which is not 100% clear, but I hope we get a bit more on will. So a Septimus, who is one step above an Octavii, will have 8 of them ceding to him. Sorry, I'm glancing at my notes for this bit to make sure I explain it right. And 7 Septimus will cede their will to a more highly ranked Sextus, who will cede to a more highly ranked Quintus, and so on and so forth. My will would be worth like a certain portion, but then a bit of my portion, very much like a pyramid scheme, will be ceded to the one above the one I'm ceding to incrementally. So you understand, people become more and more powerful the higher they get up. It's a pyramid scheme. It's kind of maths based, so it was hard for me to wrap my head around. I did have a little chart open while I was reading that I got off Reddit, but it does explain it in the start of the book as well. It explains all the numbers bits. But in the end, I kind of just stopped trying to understand like the finer machinations of it and just like enjoy the reading experience for what it was, and figured that I would understand it somewhere down the line. Very epic world building, amazing setup, amazing world building, I thought. But as is often the case with amazing world building, in the beginning I did find the characters a little bit weak. I kept forgetting Viz, our main character, is 17 at the start, which I guess, supposing given his upbringing, does make sense because he seems quite advanced, so it checks out. But he seems so much older in the beginning, and I kind of forgot his age until we reached like his 18th birthday a bit later on in the book, and I was like, oh shit, this guy's 18. I feel like the characters we don't get much description of, like apart from their appearance. So we get a lot of like frame related descriptors for the boys, like whether someone's big and bulky or lean and athletic, and then for the girls we just get like mainly hair and like their looks. I really liked the characters, actually, what we got of them. So for me it would have been a little bit better to have a bit more of them, you know, a bit more of their personalities, a bit more about who they are, a bit more rounded out. But there are a lot of characters in the beginning of this book, so I get the need not to, especially with academy settings when you've got like big classes and stuff. I get it, but I didn't really notice that we didn't have like full complete descriptions of characters until we kind of reached the end stages of the book, and then so many characters are introduced, or not introduced, but so many of these characters that have been previously mentioned are like coming into play a bit more, and I'm like, wait, who's that? They were mentioned like back then, and it just, yeah, it's a bit harder for me to figure out who was who. So like Ulcizer, he was kind of like an integral part of it, but he's kind of drab. Like his character is just kind of drab to us. We don't get more than we need. Emissa, she ends up being a key part of the book, but to me she still feels really flat as a woman and as a character. I think after the full on action of my reading experience that was Red Rising, I did really enjoy that this book varied in pace a lot. So we had some real building moments, long moments of study and long moments of dialogue before launching back into action. It was a long book. It was coming in at like nearly 700 pages, and I do think, I say this with all long books, that 100 pages could have been trimmed from it. A lot of the book was spent detailing unnecessary journeying to and from places, and some of this important dialogue did happen in those bits, but not all of them. So I just think we could have seen less of the journey. I think sometimes the journeying felt a bit longer than the action that took place once we arrived, but a lot happens, so I get it. Overall, it was pretty good. I'm interested to see where the second book takes us, and I would really like to get more detailing and explanation of like the world surrounding them, and also the use of will, because will was briefly covered, but it still feels kind of like a concept. The more will was shown to us in the book, the less I understood how will is used and what it's for. Also, the way that will was used and used to like run the surrounding society really reminded me of the way silver is used in Babel by R.F. Kuang, and also reminded me of what's the book? The way that magic is used in Blood over Brighthaven. I'm on a fine line here. This book could move into a territory of fantasy that I absolutely love, that I become like very deeply interested in, or it could tip over into a realm of just being slightly more complex than I like my fantasy reads to be. I'm not a very seasoned epic fantasy reader, so this is purely just my comprehension level and my like reading experience level. Bit of a mixed review from me, but I am actually really like looking forward to reading the second one and curious to see how it turns out. I think I need a bit of a break from fantasy for a while, like fantasy of this nature. And I say I need a little bit of a break from fantasy, but my next book I read physically, and this was Filthy Rich Vampire by Geneva Lee, and yes, this is a fantasy book. I have the physical book, I just don't know where I've put it, so I'm going to put a little picture on the screen for you. Our main vamp, Julian Rousseau, has just woken up from a 100-year nap. He's woken up from a 100-year nap right at the start of the social season, and as he is currently one of the most wealthiest vampires in existence and also one of the most eligible bachelors, he is expected to take part in this social season and find a wife before the season is through. He would rather stake himself than get married, and this is where our lovely human Thea comes into play. Thea is a cellist at one of the social season's events, and she quite literally stumbles into him. She is far too mouthy, far too naive, and far too human. But now, unfortunately, she knows about vampires and she needs some protection, so Julian strikes her a deal. Protection in exchange for pretending to be his lover. When will someone strike this kind of deal with me? Where are people meeting these vampires? So this is quite a short review for this book, I think. This was a palate cleanser book for me. I bought this secondhand because I thought, yeah, let's have some vampires. You know, I've been chasing a vampire high for like the last year, realistically since I was like 14, but for the last year in earnest. So I didn't really expect it to be any kind of decent given the cover. And while it wasn't amazing, it definitely wasn't shit. I'm not gonna lie. I can barely remember book 1 and book 2 because I read them together. Book 2's coming next. And I didn't really write down my thoughts immediately. And because this was a palate cleanser, I just kind of like binged it. I enjoyed this book for what it was. And I will say that it quenched my vampiric thirst, pardon the pun. And it quenched that thirst without being a masterpiece. But did I need a masterpiece? Not necessarily. I think it's a great premise. I really actually do love books that have like a social season in them. I love the idea of like social season, rich, horny vampires. To me, it was kind of like giving off vampire gossip girl. And it started out very strong, but to be honest, it just became a bit repetitive. I will say some good things were about it is that Julian, there are some deeply romantic quotes from old Julian. He really knows how to turn a line in a way that these modern, less than a century-old boys just don't know how to do. But in between such romantic lines, he just fell a bit flat for me. Lots of miscommunication and a third act breakup, which is just like not really my bag. And I know it's so prevalent in romance, but some of them are forgivable. It just depends on like why the third act breakup happened. What's frustrating for me about this is that Julian facilitates the miscommunication tropes because he doesn't tend to explain a lot about this dangerous new life that he's involved Thea in, and he doesn't tend to explain a lot of it to us as well. It's a dual perspective, but we don't get a lot of the why. You'll pick up the cues like when you're about halfway through. She'll ask him a question, he'll dance around it or avoid it, or quite literally have sex with her or some kind of sex with her to avoid answering the question, and she is too much of a wet lettuce to push for the answer. And then later in the book there'll be an incident where we think, oh, it would be really good if we knew about this. And that lack of knowledge then shows up in a big way and causes a problem. I will say I love an eccentric billionaire. I love the setting actually. And I love the magic element of it all. There's witches, there's familiars, there's like ancient vampiric rites, there's a social season, blood magic, all of the good stuff. But yeah, I've got to say I didn't really appreciate or love the fact that the main plot is driven 95% of the time by poor communication. I was still fairly hooked, and the reason I picked up the second book was because when I finished the first one, I was in a place of I don't know what I want to read. And for me, finishing a book at like midnight and then choosing to go into another book, that's the perfect recipe for picking up a book I don't like, because I should just go to bed, but instead I'm like, let me start the second one. So the final book I read for the month, no prizes if you can guess what it is. I read this digitally, not physically, and it is Second Rite by Geneva Lee. This is a fantasy romance, and this is The Filthy Rich Vampires Book 2. Let me just say that reviewing the second book in a series is kind of a surefire way to spoil some of the first book. So if you are planning on reading the first book, by nature, my synopsis and my review will spoil a little bit what happens in the first. So skip this, skip to the end of the video, do whatever you will. Thea Melbourne's heart is broken. She is struggling to return to her old life as a cellist. Her mother is in a coma and she has mounting medical bills to pay, and she is selling whatever she can to make ends meet. And then all of a sudden, Julian turns up at the hospital and reveals his devastating secret to her. Julian's pushed her away to save her life, but now he must decide whether he wants to continue to make this choice with Thea still in danger. He can stay away like the Vampire Council is demanding, or he can risk his life, her life, and the life of everything around her to have what they both want. This review will be even shorter because this book was so trash. I probably will be spoiling this a little bit because I just did not have a good time reading this, which was so disappointing, but also what did I expect? I tried to pretend this book wasn't really bad, but it was honestly quite impossible for me. And there were certain points that I was reading this that it felt so messy and confusing that I felt a bit drunk. I had no idea what was going on, and genuinely I tried to take this series not too seriously because in my mind it was just going to be a bit fun, and it just ended up being so meh. The second book is just entirely conflict driven, and that's fine, but it's conflict without a leg to stand on. Thea is kind of stupid in this book, and him talking or lack of talking and the miscommunication just has not made any improvements. They both love the drama as far as I'm concerned. Book 1 was kind of what you expected and somewhat enjoyable, and book 2 is just really not that much different, except for it just feels like book 1 but dragged out more. And there was one thing that took me out of it. I can't remember exactly the quote, but Julian's talking, obviously he's a really, really aged vampire, and his talking got really modern and millennial in some of it, and I was a bit this doesn't feel like it should be. Obviously you adapt and move with the times, you can't stay 400 BC forever, but I don't know, I just felt not very convinced by some of that bit, but that's a really minor thing. We had the addition of a couple of tropes in this book, a couple of new tropes that made it somewhat interesting for me. It's piqued my interest a little bit, but at the same time, because I didn't enjoy the second book at all, it's not really made me feel committed into seeing how it plays out. I did think this was a 3-book series, in which case I probably would have just persevered, because I'm such a non-series finisher and it's really annoying me. But I've seen that it's 4 books and I just actually don't think I'm going to do it. I don't know if I have 4 books in me. I'm just annoyed that I mainly put off reading some potentially great books because I was I want the vampires. Anyway, I have so little to say on this book, so if you have read them and you feel I should persevere, let me know. Make your case in the comments below, please. Anyway, that was my July reading month. Let me know what you thought. I did realise I got it wrong. I ended up reading 3 physical books and 2 digital books, so yeah, bit of a funny mixed month. I've already read 2 books in the month of August because there was a couple that I thought I'd finish in July and I just tipped over into the next month, so excited to do that wrap up for you. I was going to do a mid-year reading wrap up, but honestly I don't know that I have it in me. But yeah, I don't have Goodreads. A lot of you always ask, but I do have Storygraph, and all of that's linked in the description box along with my BookTok account. I don't post on there all the time, but I do post a few more like in-depth snippets. So feel free to follow me on there. And if you liked today's video, please let me know in the comments or drop a like on it. For those of you that are new to the channel, my upload schedule is every single Sunday and every other Wednesday. So yeah, I'll see you on the next video. Thank you so much for watching.